Hi. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Susan. I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and particularly, of course, the Center for Hemispheric Policy for giving us this opportunity to think about the Venezuelan economy, society, and the perspectives and the quagmire that the country is in currently. I want to devote my time to talking about the economy, which is what I specialize in, what I devote my time to, trying to understand what's going on with the Venezuelan economy, where is it going, and what we can expect out of the current government policies, and also to consider that as compared to what the government should be doing. And I think that if we look at the Venezuelan economy right now, I mean, it's very clear that it's a mess, right? It's very clear that you have inflation that's skyrocketing. You have inflation going at 60+%, but probably that inflation is underestimated because there's price controls and a set of reporting problems. So we're probably talking about an underlying inflation which is already considerably higher and is accelerating. We have an obvious situation of scarcity at levels which have never before seen in Venezuela, and actually in a type of phenomenon that's relatively rare in any economy, somewhat reminiscent of what was happening in the countries in the Soviet bloc in the 1980s. We have an economy that's contracting, that's going to contract probably by around 4%. It's going to have contracted by around 4% in when we get the final numbers for 2014. And maybe, depending on what policies are undertaken this year, maybe at a similar rate also, that could also be underestimated by some of the data problems. So it's very clear that there are a lot of things going wrong here. And of course, when you look at that, then the key inclination, the main reaction is, well, then that means that we have to change everything, because that means that the whole economic policy, the whole economic model is wrong. And I wouldn't contest that. I think that there are a lot of elements and I think substantively there are significant costs that the nation has paid out of the economic model that has been adopted during the past 15 years. But I think it's important to try to distinguish between the different components of that economic model and to try to understand which of them are the ones that are causing the big problems right now, because that's the only way in which we can understand, well, where is it that we're going to start in terms of the solution? Is the problem the exchange rate? Is the problem the nationalizations? Is the problem property rights? Is the problem of lack of judicial stability and rule of law and changes in the laws? Well, I mean, all of these, and you might say the problem is all of those, and that's a very tempting answer which could be right at some level, but doesn't really help address the question of how you solve the problem. Where do you start? Which of those things do you do first? Where is it that you're going to concentrate your efforts? And this is a question that is relevant, equally relevant for the current administration, as well as for any future administration that might have to face with these problems. And let's for a moment put us in the perspective of a new government. Let's suppose that there were, and I'm just going to give it a bit of teeth in terms of a scenario. Let's suppose that the government loses the parliamentary elections, you have a recall referendum, President Maduro is recalled, you have new elections, and a new president comes to power. Well, that would probably be a precedent that would have a relatively restricted, in that scenario, if it happens, according to the current constitutional rules, that it's going to have a pretty restricted time space, right? Because this is going to be a presidency that's going to last for 2.5 years. Might have a Congress, the Congress with them, but then there's a set of judicial institutions, of course, and there are problems with just about every single other institution outside of the legislative and the executive, which would at least not be initially friendly to that new administration. So it really has to pick its fights. And the question that I want to ask is, economically, what fight do we want to pick? Do we want to go there and say, okay, we have to open up the oil industry. We have to completely change the oil industry regime. We have to start privatizing firms. Or do we say, well, we have to solve the exchange rate problem. We have to devalue. We have to raise gasoline prices. Where do you spend your limited political capital, your limited ability to function as a government. And my point is that is as relevant a question for this administration as for any future administrations. And I think that you spend your limited capital at this moment in solving the relative price problem. And what I call the relative price problem is something which is, I think, quite easy to conceptualize. Venezuela the Venezuelan government survives on its dollars. You can conceive of Venezuela as one big oil well. And sometimes less comes out of that oil well, sometimes more. And when there's more that's coming out, then you sell that oil, you exchange it for other things, and that's what drives the Venezuelan economy. And all of the Venezuelan economy subsists on the imported goods that come out of those oil sales. If tomorrow that oil well dried up, I think that the next day when Venezuela would basically go into the Stone Age. And Venezuela doesn't produce anything that is not oil, in the sense that everything that it produces is essentially a way of converting the dollars that come from oil into goods and into other goods and services. But it turns out that that state, that government, which relies on those oil revenues, is basically turning around and saying, oh, I'm going to sell these dollars really cheap. And it does that in several ways. One of them is that it says, okay, the exchange rate is 6.3. And it sells dollars for 6.3 cents, for 6.3 bolivars, which are less than 6.3 cents. And then people can, and whoever gets one of those actually can do two things with that. It could do what the government wants them to do, which is to use those dollars in order to bring in goods, but then you're going to have an inspector that's going to be looking at the store at which you're selling them, trying to ensure that you're selling them at a maximum return, nominal profit rate of 30%, or you can sell them in the black market for an instantaneous 3,000%. Well, you do the math. That's what happens. There's no incentive for those dollars to become goods. And that feeds into the scarcity problem. So you have a scarcity problem which is essentially caused by price controls. And this is something very, very basic that is at the root of the way in which economists look at scarcity problems. And it's one of the three useful things that I've learned studying economics, is that when you see price controls create scarcity, and you don't have scarcity without price controls. You might have expensive goods without price controls. If you don't have enough resources to import, then the prices will go up. But when you have the level of scarcity that you have right now in Venezuela, the only explanation for this is price control. And the explanation is there. We see it. It's evident. The government is selling dollars at a ridiculously low rate. And you might say, well, but who gets those dollars at 6.3? I don't get them. The fact is that precisely because the government is selling them too cheap, then they're rationed. And then the government comes up with some rationing mechanisms to allocate those dollars to some people. And those rationing mechanisms involve corruption, but those rationing mechanisms also involve just waiting in line, because what people are doing when they're lining up is essentially lining up to buy the goods, the imported goods that the government is trying to maintain at artificially low prices, which reflect the price of that, the artificial price that it's trying to maintain for foreign exchange. So what's the end result of this? Venezuela, people who are at least sufficiently old as myself in this room have lived through Venezuela at $20 a barrel, at $15, at $8 a barrel, and there were medicines, there was toilet paper, people were driving around, there were cars, or shopping malls were being built. There was economic activity at $8 a barrel. So how come now at $40 a barrel, but no, it's not at 40, at $100 a barrel, we had a problem of the scarcity of toilet paper? Well, it's because at that moment, a roll of toilet paper in Venezuela at official prices was worth 3 cents of a dollar, and the same roll of toilet paper in Colombia sells for 56 cents of a dollar. So you're creating these massive incentives for capital flight. You're basically telling everybody, look, if you can get $1 from the government, take it out as soon as possible. But the last thing that you want to do is put it in goods in the market. So this is a mess. It's actually a mess that's not difficult to solve, because the underlying problem is this attempt to maintain dollars cheap. How does this come about? And why is it that we have this now? And you see, there's a narrative which is very appealing, which is, well, this is the moment of the collapse. This is the day of reckoning for Chavismo. They've been doing so much harm to the economy over the past 15 years that finally they're coming to terms with it. And I do not dispute, and I subscribe to the view that the policies that have been adopted during the past 15 years have had substantial costs in terms of productivity. But I think that has been reflected in the fact that Venezuela had a very low growth rate compared to other Latin American countries during the context of an oil boom. Venezuela had a per capita PPP-adjusted growth rate of 1% between 1998 and 2012. That's the lowest of any major Latin American country. But if you look at the model, so much talk about the model. If you look at the model in terms of nationalizing nationalizing the private sector, strong intervention in the price-setting mechanism, exchange controls, all of that was something that existed in 2012, up to 2012, and the economy wasn't collapsing in 2012. And the economy didn't. It was surviving. It was muddling through. It could have been doing better. It was doing well enough for it to satisfy the being able to stay in power with some type of electoral institutions constrained. And as Francisco Monaldi has said in some of his research, President Chavez paid cost because of this model in terms of popularity approvals and votes. And you had leaders like Evo Morales, like Correa, who were getting reelected with much higher margins than Chavez, precisely because Chavez was not able to deliver economically as much as those countries did in the midst of their boom. But we still had oil at $100 a barrel up until 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and the country was already in a mess. And essentially what happened here had to do with a combination of two things. One of them is an idea that started gaining force in the last days of Chavez, which was the idea that the government should get very involved in price setting. The approval of the law of just prices and costs initially in 2011, and then it's kind of more wholesale launching in 2012. And it's hard to understand to know whether this change is something that really came out of Chavez's thinking, or he was just politicking running up into the election. But the fact is that he wasn't around to explain that to everybody, and then the people who were left actually believed that that's what they needed to do, that they needed to strongly intervene in the price-setting mechanism much more than what they had done before. And you mix that with what I would say can be called the rookie mistake, which is that President Maduro, before being actually formally president, but while being in charge, broke rule number 1 of Venezuelan politics, which is you don't devalue before an election. And he devalued on February 8th of 2013, roughly 2 months before the election, and that's very costly. We know that devaluations are costly politically, much more so if they come together with what took place in Venezuela at that time, which is a loss of control and a loss of coherence in the economics cabinet, where even that devaluation was not coherent because they closed down SITME, which was a mechanism for currency allocation. It didn't replace it for anything else. And the black market rate started going up. And then Venezuela started falling into the following cycle. The black market rate goes up. That fuels inflation, and then the government has to raise salaries and its costs go up, but the government says, I'm not going to devalue because devaluation is going to fuel more inflation, so it has less revenue. So what does it do? It has to print money. If it prints money, then prices go up more, the black market rate goes up more, the exchange rate in real terms becomes more appreciated, and the government has to print more money. But then, after that initial rookie mistake, then the government said, well, no, we're not going to devalue anymore. We're not going to make that mistake again. So they started doing something which had not happened before in Venezuela, which is trying to maintain the nominal exchange rate fixed when it's clear that it's become completely out of line with anything that has to do with reality. And there is where you get into this relative price problem. So what you've done to the economy is that you've taken an economy where 60% of resource allocation happens through the private sector, and you basically left that private sector without prices. And you've created these incentives then to try to escape these price controls, which lead to capital flight, and you've created huge rents from the price controls, which lead people to devote all of their efforts to capturing those rents. I'm not just talking about kind of the military that might control the border with Colombia and might take advantage of those rents. I'm talking about the fact that there are studies showing that 2/3 of the people who are standing in lines right now are there to try to buy the products to resell them. Even the very poor actually find that it makes a lot more sense for them to buy the 5 kilos of harina pan and consume 2 of them and resell the other 3 because that way they earn an important part of their income. So effectively we have a situation in which you have a lot of resources that are not being used, and I want to put the emphasis again on this capital flight because I've tried to estimate very conservatively the capital flight figure in Venezuela, and the most conservative estimates give you $20 billion. I think it could be well more, but let's stay with that number. Well, what that means is that Venezuela could effectively, by going to a more sensible exchange rate regime, and in fact, by doing what I think it should do, which is to lift exchange controls right now, Venezuela could actually have those $20 billion that are going to capital flight now become $20 billion of goods in store shelves. And that is the basis for an expansionary adjustment. That's the reason why the exchange rate adjustment does not need to be politically costly, because it can be associated with an increase in the supply of goods. And this is something that happens in many countries. It happens when you've had runaway inflation and the setting of very strict price controls, which governments do. But usually when prices get completely out of control, it's in hyperinflation. So what's interesting about this government is that it did it before prices went the full spiral towards hyperinflation. But in that sense, in terms of the combination of very poor resource allocation, a lot of capital flight, controls, and therefore the potential for an expansionary adjustment is very similar to Brazil in '94. It's very similar to Bolivia before the hyperinflation. It's at the end of the hyperinflation. It's very similar to a country that wasn't going through hyperinflation at the moment, which is Poland, actually, which is interesting because Poland had done the same thing that Venezuela has done over the past 2 years. Poland went through a debt crisis, and as a result of that, it did a quantity adjustment, and it generated so many distortions that by liberalizing prices and by liberalizing foreign currency flows, they were able to get an economic expansion out of it. And in fact, a lot of the same discussion that we have nowadays in Venezuela was the discussion that you had in Poland. When Jeffrey Sachs, if you read about this, Jeffrey Sachs has this wonderful book, Poland's Jump to a Market Economy. When Jeffrey Sachs went to Poland, everybody was telling him, no, you can't do that. I mean, you can't liberalize prices. The government cannot resist that. They're going to overthrow the government if they do that. And in fact, when they did that, goods started appearing almost immediately on store shelves, and it's one of the reasons why this was the smoothest transition. So I just want to close by saying that, look, I think that whenever we think about adjustments in Venezuela, if we live under the fear of the shadow of the 1989 adjustment. Everybody thinks that if you raise prices of gasoline, then people are going to be rioting. This is one of the coincidences between the government and the opposition is that they both agree with that you can't raise gasoline prices because it has a huge political cost, and the only difference right now is who's going to do it. Maduro doesn't want to do it, but he wants to stay in power. The opposition wants him out of power, but they're hoping that he'll do it before they give him power so that they don't have to do it. And you see, I think that the 1989 adjustment was actually quite peculiar. It was different because you were an economy that was living through a boom It was kind of similar to what would have happened if Maduro had tried to do this in 2013, at the beginning of 2013, but it had not gone through a quantity adjustment of the type that we have. It did not have an economy that was wholly distorted by rent-seeking of the type that we have now. I think that the 1989 riots, political scientists, sociologists who've looked at this carefully, coincide that this was a very idiosyncratic event that had a lot to do with the issue of transport prices in the city of Guarenas and Guatire, and with failed negotiations over the setting of public transportation prices, and the fact that the public transport workers violated the agreement with the government, and then, well, there's a whole story associated with that, but the lesson that I think that we should learn about 1989 is not that you can't raise gasoline prices. That's the wrong lesson to learn. I think the lesson that you should learn from 1989 is a lesson that's contained in another fabulous and short books. And if you want to read 2 books to understand what has to be done in Venezuela, I think that you should read Poland's Jump to a Market Economy by Jeffrey Sachs. I think that you should read Paper Tigers and Minotaurs by Moises Naim. And the fact is that the things that you think are going to happen when you do an adjustment, the things that you fear, the people who you think are going to resist, who are going to block it, this idea that we're going to have a social explosion if we raise gasoline prices, all of those things that you're expecting, they're the ones that don't happen. And the things that you have to deal with are the ones that don't expect. What to do, for example, with all of the people who are standing in line right now who don't have jobs. I'm going to finish with this. Well, I think that we actually need a worker retraining program for them, because we actually need to incorporate them productively into the economy. That type of issues is the ones that can make an adjustment more difficult than the ones that we fear now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. And it was a wonderful sort of opening presentation, and thank you for setting the scene and for giving us your analysis of the situation.